So Joe Biden released this statement yesterday ahead of opening statements. He said, "I am the president, but I'm also a dad. Jill and I love our son. We are so proud of the man he is today. Hunter's resilience in the face of adversity and the strength he has brought to his recovery are inspiring to us. A lot of families have loved ones who have overcome addiction and know what we mean. As the president, I don't and won't comment on pending federal cases, but as a dad, I have boundless love for my son, confidence in him, and respect for his strength. Our family has been through a lot together, and Jill and I are going to continue to be there for Hunter and our family with our love and support." And Jill Biden did attend the trial yesterday, and reports suggest that she may be planning to be there throughout this process. So let's break all of this down and contrast this with the New York verdict of Donald Trump just last week with our legal eagles. Today, our legal eagles are Ron Coleman, who's the host of the Coleman Nation podcast, attorney and member of the Dillon Law Group, and Mike Donnelly, who is an attorney and also a law professor. So, gentlemen, Ron, let's start with you. I mean, this statement to me was, slightly nauseating, frankly. I mean, here's the sitting president. We all know that this is kind of I think, a sham trial up here for Hunter, just to get a conviction so that everyone can already put out the talking points that they already have from the Democrat side to say nobody is above the law and we respect the jury in the Hunter Biden trial just as much as we respect the jury in the Donald Trump verdict. I mean, isn't this kind of where we're headed?
That's where we're headed. I don't know if it's any more or less nauseating than you would have expected. It's exactly the strategy that could have been predicted. It is, you just have to always remember not to hold anything against Joe Biden because he doesn't know what day it is or what time it is. This was obviously not written by Joe Biden. That's fine. Lots of statements like this are written by lawyers, but no surprises here.
Yeah. Well, Mike Donnelly, let's turn to the actual merit, if there is any, of this case. I mean, this is a firearms charge. What exactly is Hunter Biden being charged with? I mean, we know it's not for the cocaine that was found in the White House, which a lot of people suggested maybe that was what he should have been charged with. But we'll never really know whose cocaine it was.
Well, I'd like to get back to charging people with the real crimes that they've committed, that the federal Constitution actually should allow the federal government to prosecute. And the last time I checked, the Second Amendment says that the right of the people to bear arms shall not be infringed. So what is the federal government doing in regulating the purchase of arms in the states anyway, is a question I have. But that's what Hunter Biden is being charged with. He's being charged with lying, essentially. It's a process crime. He checked the wrong box, or he said he wasn't on drugs when he was purchasing a firearm. I don't have a problem with Hunter Biden owning a firearm. I own firearms. Everyone in America should be allowed to own firearms. The question of, how and when and where, to me, is a state issue. And that's the problem here, is we're charging Hunter Biden with a federal crime for buying a gun. What, the states can't deal with this? And this is the problem, Jenna, I think, and I'd love to hear Ron's take on this. The federal government has become the biggest threat to freedom that we as Americans face because it is bloated, it is expanded beyond its constitutional boundaries, and it is encroaching on every single one of our freedoms. And purchasing firearms is one of them. So is Hunter Biden's case going to go to the Supreme Court and, finally result in the overturning of these federal firearms laws that we have? Wouldn't that be interesting?
Wouldn't that be actually an amazing thing? But yeah, go ahead, Ron.
I doubt that very much, but I actually thought you were going to say something else, Mike, when you said people should be charged with the crimes that they ought to be charged with. This man has been involved in a at least half a decade, but probably going back at least a decade to when his father was vice president, influence peddling scheme. And that's the crime he should have been charged with. And
that's my next talking point, Ron. I had to shut up to let you talk for a while.
You write things down in advance? Jenna, this is not fair.
Sorry, the game is rigged. Don't you know that? Everything is overproduced these days, Ron. Come on.
It's a complete but as Mike says, this is a process crime. He's guilty of much, much more serious crimes, much more insidious offenses against the state, and against, when I say the state, I mean the United States of America. It is incredible that they're throwing this garbage at him, which is
Yeah,
going to
but
result
wouldn't
in,
that
at most,
implicate wouldn't that implicate Joe Biden though? I mean, that's really the reason that nobody is touching any of the Burisma stuff. And I mean, and to your point, Mike, I mean, if the justice system was not so politicized and not so weaponized, and the DOJ and the state level were actually charging and not charging based on what they should, not any of these political considerations, then we would have those Burisma issues. But barista, I'm having too much coffee this morning. But we but
you could have used some
looking
more
at this,
baristas, actually.
yeah, right. But looking at this, I mean, the conservatives and the GOP base is just playing into this because everybody is so excited on social media and all of the mainstream media networks today that Hunter Biden is finally getting a trial, and they don't seem to actually care about your point, Mike, that should we be charging these types of process crimes? I mean, even when the defendant's name is Hunter Biden, I mean, it seems like everyone is just so involved in the petty political nonsense that nobody's actually considering the law here and the practical impact.
Well, I think we can trust the American people. I'd like to think that anyway. I do. I'm willing to. And I think they're going to see through that. I think on November 5th, we're going to see what the real verdict is for Donald Trump. And I agree with what Ron was saying. He's talking about the Foreign Agent Registration Act, which Hunter Biden, talk about Burisma, talk about China, who knows what else. Did he register as a foreign agent? No. Did they go after Trump people under FARA? Yes. So politicization, weaponization of the justice system is what's happened here. I don't, Hunter Biden, I feel bad for him, honestly, in some ways. I mean, he brought a lot of it on himself, but this is ridiculous. Let's charge people with the crimes that they should actually be charged with and not just go after people for political purposes.
So, Ron, if we were actually charging Hunter, we meaning the United States and the people who are supposed to be our representatives in the executive branch, if they were actually charging him for some of these other crimes like Burisma, what would that look like? And why has the Republican Congress basically just turned a complete blind eye to this in terms of the oversight committees and looking into a potential impeachment of Joe Biden? I mean, that seems to have just gone nowhere.
There's never going to be an impeachment. The Senate has already demonstrated that even when the House of Representatives impeaches someone, they simply will not fulfill their constitutional duty to hold an impeachment trial. That doesn't excuse the Republicans for not impeaching. I do think, actually, that Representative Green did submit a bill of impeachment a few months ago. It went nowhere, and a lot of Republicans look. There is a split. This goes back to a conversation that we've had, even the three of us, several times. Is, do you abuse the process because the other side is abusing the process? Now, your response to that is, Ron, Joe Biden shouldn't be impeached because Donald Trump was impeached. He should be impeached because he's a freaking criminal. The answer to that is yes. But there, to be fair, I do think it's very easy to say Republicans aren't doing anything when you have a minuscule majority in one house of Congress. Yeah, you can hold hearings, but you know what happens when you hold hearings? It merely changes the criticism to all they're doing is holding hearings. If you can't effectuate some legal remedy. And by the way, I heard a very interesting, you mentioned that I was on a program last night. Someone made a very good point, which was, you don't interrupt your enemies when they're making their mistakes. I mean, where are the Republicans on the Trump trial? The Trump trial is not a popular move by the Democrats. It has resulted in, I might be stepping on the toes of our next segment, but it has only increased certainly his war chest. Why get in the way? I'm not so sure what you can do about Hunter Biden. If you have once you come to the point where you have a Justice Department that has made itself an arm of one political party, I don't know what role there is for Congress other than defunding the entire department, and they're not going to do that.
Well, Jim Jordan has put out a potential legislative proposal to, defund a lot of these investigations, defund the FBI. I mean, I don't think that that's actually going to go anywhere. And a lot of the response to your point, Ron, was, kind of, well, where was this 3 years ago? And why hasn't Congress done anything else? I mean, Congress can be an oversight, but it's not going to stop the executive branch ultimately. I mean, that seems to be the judiciary's job. So in just the last minute we have here, Mike, I'll turn to you for this one. I mean, is that ultimately where we're going with a Trump appeal? Do you think that a U.S. Supreme Court should overturn this, or even a verdict of Hunter Biden for something like this that shouldn't even be charged, according, I think, to our panel
to see
here
the
today?
Supreme Court overturn the federal gun background check law. That's not going to happen. But why do they have that? Because Congress is abusing its power under the Commerce Clause. Let's come back to what this is all about. What's the biggest threat? The federal government has exceeded the boundaries of the Constitution. The Supreme Court has allowed it to do so, and it needs to rein it back in. And I'm hopeful we've got some justices who might be willing to do that. We have three, probably, maybe four. And that's where I think this should go.
Well, we got to leave it there, but we're going to talk about the Supreme Court in our next segment with our Legal Eagles coming up next. We are back with our Legal Eagles, Ron Coleman and Mike Donnelly, to continue to talk about the overbroad, unconstitutional use of process. But some good news coming from the Supreme Court last week, and this didn't get a whole lot of national attention because it came down from the Supreme Court the same day as the Trump verdict, but this coming from the NRA's website. The case challenged New York's requirement that applicants for concealed carry licenses demonstrate, quote unquote, proper cause to carry a firearm outside of their home. New York routinely used this requirement to deny law-abiding citizens the ability to properly protect themselves. New York is one of 6 states and the District of Columbia that operate under such a may issue regime, and the NRA has long fought to abolish this practice in favor of shall issue or constitutional carry, in which law-abiding citizens can exercise their right to carry as long as they meet certain objective criteria. So, Mike, let's start with you. This sounds really good, but at the same time, I would go even further than that. I don't think that any person should have to meet any criteria to exercise their constitutionally protected rights. Those liberties only may be foreclosed when and if the government proves beyond the standard of proof required in such a case that those liberties can in any way be restricted. I mean, why are we limiting ourselves even to this type of standard?
Well, that's a fair question. And we get into this whole federalization question again. At what point do states get to decide how they're going to police a firearm ownership in their state? I'm glad that New York, is going to be forced to let people carry guns, but at the same time, the Second Amendment, should states be able to decide these things? I'm against the federal government getting involved in states' business. So if New York wants to have a law that requires certain things of people who purchase firearms, I'm okay with New York doing that to a degree. I'm not okay with the federal government doing it. And the other thing is, apparently the NRA had a great week last week because another case came down, NRA v. Vullo, which was a First Amendment case. Maybe we can talk a little bit about that, where a New York regulator that was going after the NRA and coercing other companies to not do business with the NRA said government can't do that. Like we have to tell government regulators that they can't use their official position to coerce companies and to not do business based on the speech of that company.
Well, where is the bright line here? Yeah, go ahead. Go ahead, Ron.
Right. I mean, it's based on their speech or on any constitutionally protected conduct. I mean, they're not, they may be objecting to the NRA's speech, but what they really object to is the NRA existing and advocating for the Second Amendment. And it is framed as a First Amendment case, but that, there was a little bit of a trim, but not the kind of trim that I would have liked to see on this preposterously out of control doctrine of government speech, which we're not going to have time to get into today. But this idea that, the government can't do its job if it's not allowed to speak. it might be allowed to speak, but that speech is not protected under the Constitution, period. It's not, it has no First Amendment rights. Coming back onto this New York Carey decision, New York has used these preposterous workarounds. They've tried over and over and over to work around. Every time a Supreme Court tries to make it clear that the Second Amendment really means what it says, New York cleverly tries to do a workaround. And once again, it failed. And what is really disappointing is that 3 justices thought that was cool.
Right. Well, and going back to your comments earlier, Mike, to saying, if New York wants to impose some of these restrictions, we should leave this all to the states. I mean, that's kind of where we're at as well in the pro-life versus abortion on demand debate, where, some conservatives are suggesting, well, this is a state issue. And so, if New York, for example, wants to allow partial birth abortion on demand, it's government subsidized, then under the Constitution, they should be free to do that. I mean, where is the bright line here when we say, well, there are some limitations that are good for the whole union, and how do we navigate those distinctions?
That is a really big and important question. And, when you talk about the Second Amendment, it's been applied to the states. The court has incorporated it. Justice Scalia did that back in 2010, I think it was. And so we've got to be consistent, but we need to have a bigger conversation in this country, I feel. And that's why I'm pushing this point about federalism. The federal government is too big. It's encroaching too much in our lives. And we have to have a conversation about how that stops. And where do we draw that line? It needs to be around commerce. It needs to be around the various rights that we have, and to what extent we want to continue to pass laws that criminalize conduct based on the Commerce Clause, which I don't think was the intent of the Commerce Clause. But getting back to the gun rights, I mean, look, New York has gone too far, but they have a state legislature. We should trust state legislatures. If you don't want to live in New York, you can move to Florida, or hey, come down to West Virginia, where I live, and we've got constitutional carry. We've had it for a long time.
That's where I am right
Yeah,
now.
well said. And yeah, and Ron, I mean, I think this is a broader conversation about federalism, and we can isolate some of these top trending headlines, but really everything should be cohesive if we understand what our constitutional republic was designed to actually provide to the people, which is as much liberty as possible and as much federalism as possible. We were intended to have a very small federal government, and we've seen that just growing out of proportion. How can we even start to have a national conversation when the headlines are about Trump versus Hunter's sham trials? I mean, we're so far past all of this. I mean, I think we jumped the shark a long time ago in terms of American just basic competency of what our civil government is and should be all about.
I did a video at the end of last week after the Trump verdict came out saying people have to realize this is the kind of thing that's going on in courts all the time to people that you never heard of. We need to reform the judicial system and the criminal codes in the states and federally. And I believe that should be a platform for any candidate for public office now, that I would support a simplification, recodification, and reduction in the amount of criminal law. Let's just start with criminal. There's plenty to go on civil as well. That is how you have the conversation. A candidate, it could be Donald Trump, who knows who it could be, if he would step up at the Republican convention and say, here's something we have to do, it would be stupendous.
Well, I only saw your video outside of with the giant hot dog in the background in Times Square. That was also a great video. for listeners who aren't following Ron Coleman on X, you really should, because those are actually, to me, some of the better videos. But no, I mean, these conversations are incredibly important. Yeah, exactly. And these conversations are so important because I think, Mike, you're a law professor. You've taught a lot of students from undergrads and so forth, and it seems like there are still young people in this country that care about the American experiment, and we need to foster that and show them so that when they get into the profession, they can actually make a difference, not just become a cog in this giant, ridiculous, overbroad system.
We do. That's why your book, A Moral Basis for the Constitution, should be given to high schoolers to read, Jenna, and why education is so important. If we forget our history, we're doomed to repeat it. But if we don't even know what our history is, how can we understand the core principles that this country is founded on, which we can find in the Declaration of Independence, the Articles of Confederation, the Constitution? We're grappling with these very existential issues. What kind of a country are we going to have? Are we going to have a country where people can make their own decisions and live the lives they want to, or are they going to be controlled by the federal government?
Yeah, really well said. And these are the types of questions that we have to contemplate. We'll be right back with more on our legal panel a little bit later in the program, right after this. Well, between now and July 11th, which is the sentencing date for former President Trump out of Manhattan, it seems that his campaign is ramping up their campaigning efforts after their candidate has been tied to a trial bench for the last 6 weeks, which is utterly ridiculous. But the campaign is now on TikTok. Very interesting. And so the former president releasing his first TikTok, which was at the UFC fight a couple of nights ago. So joining me now to discuss is our very good friend, Jeff Hunt, who is a host on Salem Radio out of Denver, KNUS, 710 KNUS. And Jeff, really appreciate it. And so this was interesting to me because I think that conservatives need to use all platforms available, but at the same time, Donald Trump himself, during his administration, tried to ban TikTok, said that it wasn't good. So is there kind of a little bit of conflict here?
Well, he doesn't have to worry too much about China diving into all of his personal details because they probably already have. But look, he's pursuing that coveted middle school Tide Pod consuming demographic for this year's election. I mean, what's next? Is Donald Trump going to have an OnlyFans account? This is what presidential candidates need to do these days in an effort to try to win over. And people watch TikTok. But to your point, Jenna, I thought we were trying to ban this. And there's a lot of effort from conservatives to try to ban TikTok. And now he's got his own TikTok account. It all comes down to winning elections. That's what this is about.
And isn't it totally hypocritical then for a lot of these members of Congress who, I mean, this was a bipartisan effort to divest TikTok from ByteDance, and everybody, was pretty much pro all of this. And now all of a sudden, Donald Trump gets on TikTok. So that has to be the narrative. And we've all got to say that, Donald Trump, great. Well, let's all go follow his TikTok. Isn't there anyone who's going to stand up and say, wait a minute, maybe principles matter and maybe some consistency matters even for the Republican Party, even if we don't necessarily expect that from Democrats?
Principles matter in politics, Jenna? I'm shocked.
I'm an idealist,
my first reaction to this was, well, did something change? I mean, we were going to force them to have to sell here to an American-owned company and have the Chinese divest out of this company. But nothing has changed. The only thing that remains is that politicians want to win elections. That's what this is about. And people are getting their news from TikTok. On the same day that this is all happening, the Washington Post, right? They're having to change their entire format because people just aren't tuning into the Washington Post anymore. The old way of doing media is dying, and you have to be able to communicate to potential voters, which is what they're trying to do through TikTok. But I'm asking, please, politicians, do not take up an OnlyFans account. We don't want to see that. We're not going to change our perspective on you because we see it in your underwear. There's got to be a line somewhere. And TikTok I'm willing to deal with, but don't stretch that a little bit further. I think that would be bad news for American democracy.
Yeah, I mean, maybe that's where we're headed for the 2028 election, Jeff Hunt, which is just so preposterous. But you're so right that we couldn't have the 4-hour Lincoln Douglas style debate anymore because our medium is not sophisticated enough, and people's desire just for entertainment and spectacle is too much that we don't actually sit down and discuss issues anymore. And I find that just a really sad commentary on the American public.
And on our politicians. Could you expect a politician to debate for 4 hours on the deepest, most pressing issues this country is facing. No, it's 30-second clips for TikTok. We saw it at the hearing the other day against Fauci as well. They all talk in 30-second clips. So it's the American public, it's the American politician, it's the American mind. We're all into just consuming data and information in small little clips of our politicians dancing. So, there we go. We'll vote on who has the best dance video on TikTok.
And hey, that's the American way, right? We'll be right back with more here on Jenna Ellis Tonight. And we're back with our legal eagles, Ron Coleman, who is the host of Coleman Nation, an attorney with the Dillon Law Group, and Mike Donnelly, who is an attorney and also a law professor, because there's so much legal news even beyond the Trump verdict and Hunter Biden going on in the nation. And this coming from Catholic Vote. This was just a really tragic story. A judge chides elderly pro-life rescuer about dying in prison and her faith. After sentencing 75-year-old Paulette Harlow to 2 years in jail, Judge Colleen Kohler-Cottley quipped about the elderly pro-lifer's husband's concern that she might die in prison. The judge commented that she hopes Harlow will, quote, make an effort to remain alive because that is a, quote, tenet of her religion, according to Live Action. On May 31st, in a federal Washington, D.C. court, Kohler-Cottley sentenced Harlow to 2 years in jail and 36 months of supervised release for protesting at a notorious late-term abortion clinic in Washington, D.C. with 8 others. John Harlow, Paulette's husband, spoke in court before sentencing about his concerns for his wife's declining health and his fear that she might die in prison. Quote, in my heart, I think she's having a hard time staying alive, John said, according to Live Action. We've tried to be good people, he later added. I love my wife dearly. We're throwing ourselves on the mercy of the court. So, Mike Donnelly, I mean, this just seems like, yet again, an utterly outrageously inappropriate sentence that is specifically targeted against Christians and, Catholics and Jews, anyone who is pro-life, anyone who is faith-based, by a lot of these judges that truly are weaponizing the system.
Well, I find this judge's comments that appear to be so glib about this 75-year-old pro-life person trying to stay alive very troubling. But this is another example of the federalization of crime that we need to stop, as Ron was talking about earlier. And I think he's right. We need to reform the federal criminal code and get rid of a lot of these things. This is states can handle trespassing, and that's what this was about. These folks were protesting, but they also went into this clinic. And so people should be able to protest. They should be able to stand outside and pray silently, sing hymns, and encourage people to choose life. I'm 100% pro-life, and that is one of the most important issues to me, period. So I'm very troubled that this woman who was involved in trying to encourage people to not kill their babies was sentenced to 2 years in prison. And it certainly shouldn't be a federal crime. The other thing that I find interesting that prosecutors are now doing is they're charging people not only under this FACE, Free Access to Clinics Act, which is a crime based on Congress's Commerce Clause power, somehow using their Commerce Clause power to criminalize people protesting in front of clinics, not just abortion clinics, supposedly, but that's what they're going after. They're going after people who are encouraging people to choose life. But they're also charging them with a violation of 18 U.S.C. 241, which is a conspiracy to deprive a person of rights under law or the Constitution, which was passed in 1870, intended to protect blacks from the Ku Klux Klan. So that's what we're doing, is we're treating pro-lifers as Klan members essentially today. Is that what we're doing? Department of Justice? Really?
Wow. And it just shows how they can take the text of a law and completely manipulate it and bastardize it and just try to force their will in the ultimate sentencing on whoever they wish. And Ron, I think that Mike is right that the comments from the judge in this case were reprehensible and very disturbing. I mean, is that itself a basis of potential sentence reconsideration in this case?
It's chilling. It's absolutely chilling. And I do think that her making reference to the woman's faith is a potential ground for for appeal. Yeah, I mean, it's real reprehensible. Just isn't strong enough. What happens to a human being that, after a certain number of years in a position of essentially unquestionable and unaccountable authority, that they become so monstrous? This is really an object lesson for so much of what's wrong with government and the legal system.
Yeah, so well said. Well, in just the last 5 minutes or so that we have in this segment, let's turn to another topic, which is the Supreme Court yet again, and the upcoming remainder of the term, because there are still a lot of outstanding cases that are very important that the Supreme Court has yet to be handed down. One of those includes the Trump immunity case. A lot of us thought that the Supreme Court might weigh in on that a lot more quickly. They haven't, and they're set to finish their term before the end of the month. So, Mike, what are some of the cases that you are still waiting to see that you think are really important for viewers to pay attention to?
Well, there are 30 or so cases left for the court to decide, so they're going to have a busy June. And, court watchers are betting, okay, which is the last one they're going to drop? Is it going to be the Trump one? Is it going to be Chevron? But there are several cases I'm looking at. One, you've got the abortion by mail case against the FDA, whether you can order mifepristone. I can't even pronounce the word. Sorry, it's not a doctor. I'm a lawyer. But you've got that one. You've got the presidential immunity case you referenced, of course. One that I'm really looking at and concerned about is Moore v. United States, which is a tax case. One of the problems with the government is that they can take our money anytime they want, as much as they want, and then they can borrow when they can't get enough. And so this case, Moore v. U.S., is about whether unrealized gain from foreign ownership of shares is legit. Basically, they want the government to be able to tax us even though we haven't actually received the money. So that's one I'm particularly paying attention to. And then the Chevron cases and whether Chevron's going to be overruled or not.
Yeah, and so let's dive into that a little bit more really quickly, Mike. With Chevron deference is basically whether the rule that Congress has set that the executive branch can just interpret it on their own in any reasonable way. And so basically you're just giving legislative purview to the executive branch, and there's too much of the administrative state involved. And so we want to kind of reel that one back. And I think that if Justice Gorsuch has his way, he'll be chomping at the bit to overturn Chevron deference, just for viewers who maybe aren't as familiar with that particular doctrine. But Ron, in the last 2 minutes, what cases are you particularly concerned about?
I would add Murphy versus Missouri. And my only concern is just how many votes do we get? I mean, I do think it's going to go the right way. I do think the Supreme Court is going to recognize that the federal government and hopefully state governments have no business policing the internet for truth as the government determines it to be for any reason.
And
that's a
net
really
choice
important
cases,
one.
right? The net choice v. Texas case, right? And Murphy?
Yes.
Right. These are free
Absolutely
speech cases.
right.
So Murphy, net choice, and the NRA v. Vullo, we got some really important free speech cases that have come and are going to come out of the court. And I'm encouraged by the 9-0 on NRA v. Vullo. It was a motion to dismiss case that came out last week.
That's right.
But I mean, it shows that the court is leaning into free speech, and that's really good. I think that's important.
Yeah, and especially with what we saw yesterday coming out of Congress and the hearings with Dr. Fauci, who was just, rolling back all over himself to try to explain away the ridiculous COVID mandates. And he basically conceded that he simply made up everything. I mean, all of us remember that. It was not that long ago, some of these ridiculous mandates. And so that the Murphy case goes directly to the heart at saying that the government can't just give you a narrative and say that you have to believe it. We should be able to question things, even in the midst of a so-called, worldwide pandemic and all of these other things. We should be able to hear from different voices and determine for ourselves what we want to do about it. And I think that goes to what the main thread of all of these legal panels on this show so far, that government needs to be smaller on the federal level, and people need to have more and more freedom to determine for themselves and their families how we want to exercise our liberties. And so So Mike, with this court, there was an interesting article you sent to me yesterday that it's almost this 3-3-3 split based on some math, which I'm a lawyer, not a doctor either, so I can't do math. I'm not a mathematician, not a biologist, but I do know what a woman is. But the 3-3-3 split, we've been saying for a while, that's very interesting on the court. And I think that moving forward into the remainder of the court's term, it's going to be interesting how that kind of split with the conservatives really stays, and then how you have the moderates and maybe some of the swing votes with Kavanaugh and Roberts on some of these very critical issues. So it's very important to pay attention to the court, but really appreciate your time. Ron Coleman, Mike Donnelly on our Legal Eagle panel. Always appreciate breaking it down. We'll be right back with more here on Jenna Ellis Tonight.